You might have wondered, how is it that some people will become infected with something like COVID and others will be right next to them and somehow escape the infection altogether? Well, in this video I discuss rabbits and plagues and immunity and diversity and evolution, and we see how often very small genetic differences between individuals creates the diversity needed for communities as a whole to escape the worst of a plague. Well, we're here in beautiful Eden on the south coast of New South Wales, and this is the traditional land of the Thua people of the Yuin nation. And the reason why we're making this video is that when we came to this campsite, there were lots of rabbits around, rabbits bouncing around all over the place. And I thought that was interesting because it made me think about the history of rabbits and their survival and their immunity in Australia. Now, they're not really native to Australia. They were introduced in the 1860s, and it turns out that a recent study has demonstrated that pretty much all of the rabbits that have infested the whole continent of Australia, they're all from one single population, one single small population of rabbits that was introduced by a fellow called Thomas Austin for hunting purposes. And the reason why that's interesting is that this one population of rabbits spread across the nation, but other introductions, other small populations of rabbits that were introduced into Australia weren't able to do that. It turns out that they did not have the small genetic differences that made Thomas Austin's rabbits particularly good at invading Australia, and those rabbits that weren't from that small population, they just couldn't survive. They didn't do well. They either died out completely or they remained as very small local populations. So it turns out that very small genetic differences can allow one population to flourish and another to languish. Now, I might be a little bit fond of rabbits because they're cute, but I think I'd feel about it very differently if I was a farmer and I had a family to feed and perhaps a banker breathing down my neck as well. Because back in the early part of the 20th century, rabbits were a real problem. They were eating farmers out of house and home. Myxomatosis is an infection in rabbits. It's a pox virus, and it causes very nasty symptoms and ultimately respiratory distress and death. And this is spread by direct contact between rabbits, but also by mosquitoes and fleas. And in the 1950s, myxomatosis was released into Australia to try and kill off the rabbits, and it killed up to 99.8% of the rabbits that were infected. Now, this is a graph showing the number of rabbits over time, and you can see that numbers of rabbits were very, very high in the early 1950s, introduction of myxomatosis, and the numbers crashed. But what's interesting to look at is what happened after that, because with time the number of rabbits started to rise again. And that's because of two things that were happening. First of all, rabbits were developing resistance to the virus. They were being selected, those minor genetic difference amongst that population that made some rabbits more resistant to the virus than others, well, they were being selected for very, very strongly, so that the rabbit population was becoming more resistant to the virus. And also at the same time, the virus was being selected for being less virulent, for being less nasty. And the reason is obvious, that a virus is only really going to be successful if it doesn't kill its host. If it kills everybody that it infects, well, then there's ultimately no one left to infect. So two strong evolutionary forces resulted in the slow return in rabbit numbers. In the 1960s, some clever scientists introduced rabbit fleas, and what happened there is that the rabbit fleas started to kill off more of the rabbits because they were able to spread, even though the virus was less aggressive. And you can see also the resistance of rabbits on this other curve, this smooth curve there, by the way. Even though the rabbits were more and more resistant against the virus, just spreading the virus more frequently using fleas resulted in more rabbit deaths. So this is a very nice example of how genetic diversity and evolutionary pressures are involved with protecting us against infections, and also how viruses and and different animals will evolve to defend themselves against infection. But for evolution to work, there needs to be diversity in the gene pool. There needs to be variation amongst individuals from which natural selection can select. So when people think about genetic diversity and immune diversity, usually we're talking about diversity in specific immunity. And specific immunity really is unbelievably specific. If you think about a bacterium, for example, or a virus, well, it's composed of many, many different specific chemicals, many proteins, for example. Now, specific immunity is against one particular protein from that infective agent. But not only from one particular protein, it's actually against one tiny fragment of that protein, one little fragment that's called a hapten. So it really is amazingly specific because it's against one small part of a whole organism. So specific immunity is very powerful, and there are particular mechanisms for generating specific immunity. There is major histocompatibility antigens that are varied between individuals, so that some people have sets of major histocompatibility antigens that are very good at recognizing a particular antigen, a particular hapten, and others, well, they just luck out and they don't have it. And there are also variants in particular receptors that that lymphocytes and other immune cells in the body have to detect antigens. So there are all these variations in specific receptors for haptens and for antigens amongst cells that help to account for specific immunity. And there's a random shuffling of these molecules amongst individuals, and indeed the particular receptors on lymphocytes have mechanisms for being randomly shuffled on their binding sites, and so do antibody molecules. Antibody molecules and lymphocyte receptors that detect particular haptens, particular antigens, are in fact being randomly shuffled in the DNA within individual cells within our own bodies. So there's a constant process of random shuffling of relevant DNA and random selection, so that some people in the population will be lucky and just have the right mix of major histocompatibility and lymphocyte receptor and antibody molecules to protect themselves, and very unfortunately others will be less lucky. And that's just the randomness of specific immunity. And so that's why some people will survive very often, some people who will respond well to immunisation, and others won't. Now, that's only one part, however, of the immune system. Now, the specific immune system has only really been around since the time of the jawed fishes. That's around about 350 or so million years ago. In fact, the same time that the rocks here in Eden were being laid down, that was the time of the jawed fishes emergings in evolution, our jawed fish ancestors in fact, and they were the first ones to have important components of the specific immune system. But in fact, they had ancestors as well, and life on Earth goes way, way back earlier than that, to the earliest multicellular life, back about 600 million years earlier. And the earliest life on Earth was about 3.7 billion years ago. Now, all of those ancestors, before specific immunity arose, well, they also faced infections. They also had this problem of plagues running through their populations. So they too needed to have defense mechanisms, and that's this non-specific immune system that we're talking about. And of course, the non-specific immune system also benefits from diversity. There are lots of parts to the non-specific immune system. One thing that you consider, for example, is the surface of the skin. It keeps the bacteria and other infectious agents out. Stomach acid, for example, well, the high acid content kills a lot of bacteria. Proteins like lysozyme in saliva or milk that break down bacterial walls. But one part that I think is most interesting is the inflammatory response. It's the response of the body to any sort of injury, any sort of infection. The inflammatory response itself is controlled by a whole host of different chemical signals and receptors and signaling mechanisms. And when I was a young scientist, about 40 years ago, what I was very interested in at the time, because they were relatively recently discovered, was this thing called cytokines. Cytokines are protein signals. They're a bit like hormones that cells release to control different parts of the inflammatory response and the immune system. And there was a sense that if we could only understand cytokines, then we'd really understand inflammation. And so I was very lucky. I found a postdoctoral position in Melbourne to study cytokines. And actually working with them, it became very clear to me after a while that it was sort of silly. There were so many cytokines, and yet so many of them seem to have pretty much the same activity. There seemed to be unbelievable redundancy, unbelievable backup. So many of these signals were doing exactly the same thing. Why have so many cytokines when they all seem to overlap so very much in their biological activity? It just didn't make sense to me. And quite a few people were telling me, well, look, it makes sense because really there needs to be backup. They're very important, it's important molecules, so we need to have good backup. But that just didn't seem to gel with me. I couldn't see any evolutionary pressure to generate that much backup. It seemed impossible. But when I thought about it a bit more, it seemed more clear to me that maybe there'd be evolutionary pressure for there to be diversity in the non-specific immune system, just as there is in the specific immune system. Because evolution can only work on something that's there, and the more cytokines there are, the more players there are in the field, well, then the more things there are for evolution to work with. Now, over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of work done on what are being called polymorphism, tiny variations in the structure of proteins. Tiny variations in the structure of proteins that often have very little effect on the activity, but nonetheless may be important. People have been studying this for some time, and particularly with regard to cytokines, it turns out that these polymorphisms can be really important. Now, it turns out that many of these cytokines, many of the polymorphisms in these cytokines correlate fairly strongly with a whole bunch of separate diseases. In my patch of dentistry, for example, there are particular cytokine polymorphisms that make you susceptible to periodontal disease, for example. But it turns out that many, and probably in time will be shown almost certainly most, maybe all, diseases are in fact strongly influenced by the polymorphisms that we all have, that generate diversity amongst each other for the response to infections and autoimmune disease and so forth. And when we look at our most recent pandemic, we look at the COVID pandemic, in as much as rabbits have suffered myxomatosis, well, we recently suffered a pandemic as well. And when people have looked at polymorphisms in cytokines related to COVID infections, I'll just show you this graph here. You can see the results of a recent study that demonstrated that for a set of, 5 separate important cytokines, that depending upon the minor variations, the minor polymorphisms in each of these different cytokines that individuals had, they became more or less sensitive to COVID. And of course, if you're just unlucky enough to have polymorphisms that amongst a whole bunch of cytokines that make you more sensitive to COVID, well, then you're probably going to suffer much more from the disease than people who don't have those polymorphisms. And other individuals, well, they just may be so fortunate that they've got polymorphisms that are very protective against COVID. So diversity, both specific and non-specific, in the immune system ensures that someone always survives the plague. All of life, all the history of life and all the history of humanity has been a history of one plague after another. Vast numbers of people are killed off by these appalling infections, and others survive, and they carry on to carry on the species. And I suppose that's reassuring, but survival doesn't necessarily mean that the plague itself is not a curse. I mean, although rabbits are resistant to myxomatosis now, it still kills about 40 to 50% of those who are infected. And with COVID, Well, it's still early days. I suppose we're yet to find out. But just like the rabbits hopping around here, they're mostly all right. Humans are mostly all right. We've got COVID now endemically spread throughout the population, but there's always going to be a few very sick bunnies. Now, nonetheless, diversity in immunity is a blessing, and I like to think also that diversity in people is a blessing as well. And I'm in Australia. This is an enormously diverse country. And I like to think that the diversity of individuals and of cultures in my country make it stronger and better. Now this is a graph drawn from publicly available data in the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and that shows enormous growth in the Australian population. In my lifetime, the Australian population has more than doubled. And that's not because Australians breed like rabbits, it's actually because this is a country of great immigration. This is another graph. It's taken from the Statistica website, and it shows that if you look at first generation migrants, well, that's about 28% of the population, and about 20% of the population are second generation migrants. So in fact, 28% of the people, almost 30% of Australians, were born in another country. And about 20% of the population are the children of people born in another country. That's about half of the Australian population has come from somewhere else. What does an Australian look like? Well, in truth, an Australian now looks like pretty much anyone who could be under the sun. Now, I know not everyone's going to agree with me, but I think that this great cultural diversity gives us strength. It's not just interesting, it's not just nice and fun to go off and eat in different kinds of restaurants. I think that this diversity across all aspects of humanity that these cultural influxes gives us great strength. Because we evolve not so much physically as humans, we evolve culturally. And evolution can only happen where there is diversity. So they're my musings on rabbits. I hope you've enjoyed this short video. If you have, please do like and subscribe and share. But no matter what, I'd just like to thank you for your attention.